As far as the defense kind of gradually getting a little bit worse as the year went on and the offense getting better as the years on, what do you kinda take away from that? Do you think that, like, maybe there's I'm not even gonna say a disconnect or anything like that, but do you think that maybe, like, some of these defensive players maybe are starting to lose a little bit of confidence? Maybe the offense is starting to gain confidence? What do you take away from, like, both of those sides of the football?
Well, you can look at it two ways, right? I mean, early in the season, we weren't playing the talent of teams that we're playing now later in the season, at least offensive talent. I think
Right.
Tennessee was a little bit overrated offensively, right? But you had Charlie, you had a bunch of teams that were sprinkled in there that weren't very good offensively that couldn't put a lot of points on the board. And Austin Armstrong has a pretty good defensive scheme. If anybody really took a look at it, it's a good defensive scheme. Now, take a look at Florida's too deep. You're playing a lot of freshmen. You're playing a lot of sophomores. You're playing a lot of guys that hadn't played a lot of football. So
Yeah.
as the season naturally goes on, those guys either get worn down, they get mentally fatigued, they hit that kind of what they call in the NFL the rookie wall.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of things being counted against the defense, and even assignment football. You got some of the older guys that are counted on to do a little bit more, have a little bit more, assignments to do more things. So, and it's still a brand new system, which everybody doesn't understand. Is that there's going to be rockiness in it. It's not like hey, you bring in a new defensive coordinator. He's Monty Kiffin of the old Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and you start firing on all cylinders. That's just not what it is. We would love for it to be that, but it's just not what it is. So there's holes in the defense, and coming out the gate, nobody knew what Austin Armstrong was going to be. So he was surprising a lot of guys. But as stuff starts to get on film and things start to go on tape, you start to scheme around his defensive scheme. And if
Mm.
you don't have the players or not the talent, because I think Florida's very talented. We see a lot of these young guys, but if you don't have the experience on defense, you don't have those guys that are up to that level of a much more mature team, then you're going to get a lot of points scored on them. You're going to get holes in that defense. You're going to get things that they're going to make freshman or sophomore mistakes. So I do think he's the right guy for the job. I do think everything that we've seen scheme wise, it's like, hey man, we're loving the blitzing off the edge. We're loving the fact that he's creating pressure, things that we hadn't seen in the last couple of years. And even at that point in time, I think once he gets his guys and some big defensive tackles in there that can hold the line of scrimmage, and his linebacker core, which is kind of tops in the country right now as far as recruiting goes. Once these guys come in and he gets these guys settled down, I think you'll see exactly what the defense is going to be. Now, I'm not. This is not a shot against the offense because the offense has somewhat been a revelation. But once again, offenses start slow, right? As the season goes on, Billy gets these guys fired up. They start to understand the scheme. These guys get going, and then all of a sudden, you get offensive explosions like you did at South Carolina, or you have
Yep.
guys come. You got a Florida Gator team which never should have came back from 14-0 down in the first quarter to then tying the game up and making it a game. So there's a lot of things counted against them, but they're a young team and they're going to get better. I think people just need to understand that.
Now let me ask you this, because I know I love asking former players questions, because then I get to figure out what actually, like, what happens with players and how everything else goes. Now we have Jason Marshall, he's been there for a long time. He's a veteran player.
Mhm.
Jane Hill, veteran player. Kimber, veteran player, college-wise, really hasn't really started, I guess, until this year on the other side of the football with Jason Marshall. They've
Right.
given up the most yardage on this team out of all the defensive positions. Now, how do you that attribute? Is that part of, being a veteran player, trying to learn a new system, having 2 DCs like that? And, I would say, I guess it's a mixture of maybe not, getting a lot of pressure from the D line on top of that. But how do you attribute, because I expected a heck of a lot more from Jason Marshall this year. And I'm not gonna just blame it on him. You gotta blame it on some of the coaching staff, all that other kind of stuff too, getting prepared for games. How do you attribute, like, veterans kind of, like, struggling right now with this new defense or Austin Armstrong, or, is it just, like, a mentally hard thing to do when you start changing coaches like that?
Yeah, it is. You talk about there's certain positions on the field that will struggle in a new system versus a player that you could probably plug and play, right? So you got kickers that are naturally just going to kick the ball through the uprights, right? That's the easiest position when it comes to knowing your assignment and knowing what to do. Or a punter, you know how to punt the ball. Hey, that's just what it is. But there's specific positions such as quarterback and offensive line, which they play together, and cornerback specifically because if you're a cornerback used to playing in a man coverage system, then all of a sudden you have to switch to a cover two system. That's really weird. That messes with your head, or even a cover three, which we saw last year under a different defensive coordinator. So you got a
Yeah.
guy who Jason Marshall's talented. I think a lot of people that watched him over the course of the last couple of years realize how talented the kid is. He's going to be a guy that plays in the NFL. Don't know what round he goes, but he's going to be a guy that plays in the NFL. I don't think you can really count what happened here in college. It's just take a look at what happened with Marco Wilson. I think a lot of his talent and what he did is based off the fact that he had a bunch of defensive systems he had to run. You know, he came in his last year just wasn't very good, but that's just because he was trying to take on too much. He was adjusting to a system on the fly. It didn't fit him. It didn't fit his skill set. And I think the same thing can be said about Marshall. I don't think he's a bad player. I think he's a great player. Before the season started, he was one of those guys that could have gone in the first round of the NFL draft here coming up next year. Can that still happen? Maybe, and if he tests well and things happen to fall in his favor. But it's not due to the fact he's a bad player. It's just maybe the scheme doesn't fit him. He's still trying to figure it out, or even he's trying to help other guys, those young freshmen, those young safeties, those young cornerbacks below him, try to figure this scheme out too. Because just as much as everybody believes, these guys come into college and you have 1 to 2 years to learn a system before you're really thrusted it in to start playing. Well, when you get a new defensive coordinator, you're going to be a freshman all over again because you're learning the same system as those guys coming in after you. So you can't automatically say, well, you're talented enough to learn the defensive scheme and become and be that same player. That's just not the reality of the situation.
Yeah.
So speaking kind of just to that, you saying he's worried about his players, the guys around him. Look, possibility he's just not trusting, and not in a negative way, the freshmen around him to follow their position. So he's thinking, second guessing what he's about to do because the team around him is so young. So that is something to speak about. Look, I think it's gonna be promising to hear. A lot of people are gonna be excited to hear about the scheme that Armstrong is calling, and it is refreshing because we all want to believe that. Look, we keep stating that it is a young team, but I was starting to doubt myself a little bit because if you look at the 247 recruiting talent level, we're top 20, and you did say, hey, the team is talented, but that doesn't talent and experience are not the same thing. Those are two different areas of on the football field. So if you don't have a lot of experience, like you said, you're gonna hit that rookie wall. Fatigue starts to set in. And I was starting to think like I played golf in high school. I've talked about that. When you don't play 18 holes a lot, you go into that second nine, you start to get a little bit tired. I'm solid 1 through 9, but you start to struggle in that back half, and that's just the lack of playing. That doesn't mean I'm a bad golfer. I haven't worked on that second half of the game yet, and that's where that new team is. So also a good point, like you just said, this is a whole new system. This is 3 new systems in 3 years. So Jason Marshall has had a new defensive coordinator year after year after year, and has still been somewhat a very effective cornerback. I think they started using him a lot better the last few games, coming off the edge, getting some big stops, jumping up. I think Armstrong realized I'm not utilizing him in the right way, which also compliments, I think, Armstrong and the ability to adapt. Would you say that?
Well, I do think you bring into another point into the light is that for great cornerbacks, you can take a look throughout time. Those shutdown cornerbacks that have came out of college have had somewhat good defensive lines. Like I can rewind it back to when Lito Shepard came out of the University of Florida. He had guys like Alex Brown and Gerard Warren, and he had guys creating pressure up front that wasn't going to let the quarterback sit on his spot all day and just have 5 or 6 seconds to find a receiver. I don't know really any great corner that can cover a receiver for 5 seconds. That's just not a realistic situation.
Sure.
Joe Hayden, you can go back throughout time, even just with the Florida Gators, but beyond that. So I do think there is something to be said about the talent around the entire team, about creating pressure, about understanding the defensive scheme that will ultimately help another guy in the mold of Jason Marshall, because we'll have other guys like that. So I do think the overall defensive scheme will work. It's just that all the parts have to fit together before it happens at that point.